Hi aspirants, in my lecture number 14, I will discuss the topic disaster management part 2. The remaining topics will be covered in subsequent videos. This lecture will cover database, definition of terms risk, vulnerability and hazards. We will also discuss vulnerability profile, hazard profile of India, primary climatic events and secondary climatic events, evolution of disaster management in India, disaster management framework and disaster management acts. In this video, we will also discuss the question which has appeared in Civil Services Paper 3 Mains Examination 2020. The question says, discuss the recent measures initiated in disaster management by Government of India, departing from the earlier reactive approach. Please follow my lecture to the end. I will give you the hints needed to answer this particular question. Now let me start with the lecture. First, we will discuss database, which is crucial for capturing data on various disasters and its impact on socio-economic life. First, the mechanism for preparing a database for different kinds of disasters happening across the country is being developed and modified accordingly. National Institute for Disaster Management, under the Disaster Management Act 2005, has been tasked with research work, and it is expected that it develop a robust mechanism to capture such data on the disasters, including its impact on socio-economic life of the nation and GDP growth. At the global level, the three main sources which have been collecting the data are EMDAT, NatCat and Sigma. EMDAT is the acronym for data that is the Center for Research on the Epidemiology on Disasters, has been collecting from the country since 1987. Second is the Munich Reinsurance Company, which maintains NatCat, and third is the Swiss Reinsurance Company, which maintains Sigma. The authenticity of the data collected by these agencies varies, and the figures given by them do not necessarily attest to any comprehensive data and may be exaggerated sometimes. Second, lack of central statistical database as a record of past disasters is a major constraint for risk assessment and compilation of disaster history in the country. Different sources of data have different figures of casualties and impacts, thereby hindering an objective assessment. Scientific data on major hazards are available, but information on vulnerabilities are scattered in multiple places. Third, disaster information available from different sources are yet to be regularly assessed by common public as well as other stakeholders. Fourth, in India, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation have taken initiatives for collection of data in respect of different disasters. A technical committee was constituted by the Central Statistics Office with a view to prepare a framework for disaster statistics to develop a database on disaster and related aspects. Now we move on to understand the meaning of the term risk. Risk is a measure of the expected losses due to a hazardous event of a particular magnitude occurring in a given area over a specific time period. Risk is also a function of the probability of particular occurrences and the losses each would cause. The level of risk depends on three factors. First, nature of the hazard. Second, vulnerability of the elements which are affected. Third, economic value of those elements. Now, we will define vulnerability. It is defined as the extent to which a community, structure, service, or geographic area is likely to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of particular hazard on account of the nature, construction, and proximity to hazardous terrain or a disaster-prone area. Now, what do we mean by hazards? Hazards are defined as phenomena that pose a threat to people, structures, or economic assets and which may cause a disaster. They could be either man-made or naturally occurring in our environment. The extent of damage in a disaster depends on the impact, intensity, and characteristics of the phenomenon, and second, how people, environment, and infrastructures are affected by that phenomenon. This relationship can be written as an equation: disaster risk equals hazard plus vulnerability. Now we will discuss vulnerability profile of India. India has been vulnerable in varying degrees to a large number of natural as well as human-made disasters on account of its unique geoclimatic and socio-economic conditions. It is highly vulnerable to floods, droughts, cyclones, earthquakes, landslides, avalanches, and forest fires. Now let us move to another topic, which is hazard profile of India. India is one of the 10 worst disaster-prone countries of the world. The country is prone to disasters due to a number of factors, both natural and human-induced, including adverse geoclimatic conditions, topographic features, environmental degradation, population growth, urbanization, industrialization, non-scientific development practices, etc. The basic reason for the high vulnerability of the country to natural disasters is its unique geographical situations. As far as the vulnerability to disaster is concerned, the five distinctive regions of the country, that is Himalayan region, the alluvial plains, the hilly part of the peninsula, and the coastal zone have their own specific problems. Second, the natural geological setting of the country is the primary basic reason for its increased vulnerability. The geotectonic features of the Himalayan region and adjacent alluvial plains make the region susceptible to earthquake, landslides, water erosion, etc. Third, the tectonic features characteristics of the Himalayas are prevalent in the alluvial plains of Indus, Ganga and Brahmaputra too, as the rocks lying below the alluvial plains are just extensions of the Himalayan regions only. Thus, this region is also quite prone to seismic activities. Fourth, the western part of the country, including Rajasthan, Gujarat, and some parts of Maharashtra, hit very frequently by drought situation. If monsoon worsens, the situation spreads in other parts of the country too. The disturbance in the pressure conditions over oceans results into cyclones in coastal regions. The geotectonic movements going on in the ocean floor make the coastal region prone to tsunami disasters. Fifth, the extreme weather conditions, huge quantity of ice and snow stored in the glaciers, etc. other factors which make the country prone to various forms of disaster. Sixth, various human-induced activities like increasing demographic pressure, deteriorating environmental conditions, deforestation, unscientific development, faulty agriculture practices, and grazing. Unplanned urbanization, construction of large dams and river channels are also responsible for accelerated impact and increase in frequency of disasters in the country. Seventh, vulnerability to disasters or emergence of chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear origin has increased on account of socio-economic development. Heightened vulnerabilities to disaster risk can be related to expanding population, urbanization and industrialization, development within high-risk zones, environmental degradation and climate change. Eighth, climate change is expected to increase the frequency and intensity of current extreme weather events and give rise to new vulnerabilities with differential spatial and socio-economic impacts on communities. The unprecedented increase is expected to have severe impacts on the hydrological cycle, water resources, droughts, flood, drinking water, forest and ecosystems, sea level and coastal area losses of coastal wetlands and mangroves, food security, health and other related areas. The impact would be particularly disaster for developing countries including India and further degrades the resilience of poor vulnerable communities which make up between one quarter and one half of the population of the most Indian cities. Ninth, what are the reasons for concern? There is clear evidence that the observed change in surface temperature, rainfall, evaporation and extreme events in climate change is a significant environmental challenge. The main impact of global climate change will also be felt due to changes in climate variability and weather extremes. There is thus an urgent need for a paradigm shift in disaster management, especially under changing climate. 10th, for poverty and disaster vulnerability. Poverty and risk to disasters are inextricably linked and mutually reinforcing. The poor sections of the society is worst affected in case of disaster. The situation further aggravates due to the compulsion of the poor to exploit environmental resources for their survival, increasing the risk and exposure of the society to disasters, in particular those triggered by flood, drought and landslides. Now we move to what are the primary climatic events. First is cold wave, fog, snowstorms and avalanches. Second is hailstorm, thunderstorm and dust storms. Third is extreme temperature. Fourth is tropical cyclone and tidal wave. Fifth is floods and heavy rain. Sixth is droughts, which are hydrological, meteorological, and agricultural, etc. What are the secondary events, which are climate driven? That is, first is incidence of epidemics or diseases. Second is urban and rural water shortage. Third is crop plantation failure or harvest failure. Fourth is malnutrition or undernutrition and hunger. Fifth is landslides, saline water intrusion, and mud flows. Now we move to another topic which is very important from the question which I have mentioned it at the outset. This is evolution of disaster management in India, bit of a history. Disaster management in India has evolved from an activity-based reactive setup. This is the first thing, reactive setup, to a proactive institutionalized structure, from single faculty domain to a multi-stakeholder setup, and from a relief-based approach to a multi-dimensional proactive holistic approach for reducing risk. The beginnings of an institutional structure for disaster management can be traced to the British period following the series of disasters such as famines of 1900, 1905, 1907 and 1943 respectively, and the Bihar and Nepal earthquake of 1937. Over the past century, the disaster management in India has undergone substantive changes in its composition, nature and policy. Now we move to disaster management during British administration and post-independence. During the British administration, relief departments were set up for emergencies during disasters. Such an activity-based setup with a reactive approach. This is basically the reactive approach which the question has mentioned. Such an activity-based setup with a reactive approach was functional only in the post-disaster scenarios. The policy was relief-oriented and activities included designing the relief codes and initializing food for work programs. Post-independence, the task for managing disasters continued to rest with the relief commissioners in each state, who functioned under the Central Relief Commissioner with the role limited to delegation of relief material and money in the affected areas. Every 5-year plan addressed food disasters, flood disasters under irrigation, command area development and flood control. Under this stage, the disaster management structure was activity-based, reactive, functioning under the relief departments. Now we will discuss the emergence of institutional arrangement in India, which will discuss the holistic approach, in addressing the disaster which wreaks havoc. First, a permanent and institutional setup began in the decade of 90s with setup of a disaster management cell under the Ministry of Agriculture following the declaration of the decade of 1990 as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction by the UN General Assembly, following series of disasters such as Latur earthquake 1993, Malpa landslide 1994, Orissa supercyclone 1999 and Bhuj earthquake 2001. A high-powered committee under the chairmanship Secretary Ministry of Agriculture was constituted for drawing up a systematic, comprehensive and holistic approach towards disasters. There was a shift in policy from an approach of relief through financial aid to a holistic one for addressing disaster management. Consequently, the Disaster Management Division was shifted under the Ministry of Home Affairs in 2002 and a hierarchical structure for disaster management evolved in India. Now we move on to what would be the organizational structure of disaster management. The Disaster Management Division is headed by the Joint Secretary in Ministry of Home Affairs, who is assisted by 3 directors, undersecretaries, section officers, technical officers, senior economic investigator, and consultants and other supporting staff. The upper echelon of the structure consists of Secretary, Border Management, Home Secretary, Minister of State in charge, and the Home Minister. Now, what would the disaster management framework look like? Shifting from relief and response mode, that is the reactive mode, disaster management in India started to address the issues of early warning systems, forecasting and monitoring set up for various weather-related hazards. A structure for flow of information in the form of warnings, alerts and updates about the oncoming hazard also emerged within this framework. A multi-stakeholder high-powered group was set up by involving representatives from different ministries and departments. Some of these ministries were also designated as the nodal authorities for specific disasters. Following a high-powered committee report on disaster management for establishment of a separate institutional structure for addressing disasters and enactment of a suitable law for institutionalizing disaster management in the country, a multi-level links between these ministries and the disaster management framework had emerged. Then what is the present structure for disaster management in India? First, the institutional structure for disaster management in India is in a state of transition. The new setup following the implementation of the Act is evolving while the previous structure also continues. Thus, the two structures coexist at present. The National Disaster Management Authority has been established at the center, and the State Disaster Management Authority at state and district authorities at district level are gradually being formalized. In addition to this, the National Crisis Management Committee, part of the earlier setup, also functions at the center. The nodal ministries, as identified for different disaster types of function under the overall guidance of the Ministry of Home Affairs, Nodal Ministry for Disaster Management. This makes the stakeholders interact at different levels within the disaster management framework. Second, within this transitional and evolving setup, two distinct features of the institutional structure for disaster management may be noticed. Firstly, the structure is hierarchical and functions at four levels: center, state, district, and local. In both the setups, one that existed prior to the implementation of the Act, another that is being formalized post-implementation of the Act. There have existed institutionalized structures at the center, state, district, and local levels. Each preceding level guides the activities and decision making at the next level in hierarchy. Secondly, it is a multi-stakeholder setup, that is, the structure draws involvement of various relevant ministries, government departments, and administrative bodies. Now we take up one of the most important acts, that is the Disaster Management Act 2005. This act provides for the effective management of disaster and for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. It provides institutional mechanisms for drawing up and monitoring the implementation of the disaster management. The Act also ensures measures by the various wings of the government for prevention and mitigation of disasters and prompt response to any disaster situations. Second, the Act provides for setting up a National Disaster Management Authority under the chairmanship of the Prime Minister, State Disaster Management Authorities under the chairmanship of the Chief Ministers, District Disaster Management Authorities under the chairmanship of Collectors and District Magistrates and Deputy Commissioners. The Act further provides for the constitution of different executive committees at national and state levels. Under its aegis, the National Institute of Disaster Management for capacity building, a National Disaster Response Fund for response purpose have been set up. It also mandates the concerned ministries and departments to draw up their own plans in accordance for financial mechanisms such as creation of funds for response, National Disaster Mitigation Fund, and similar funds at the state and district levels for the purpose of disaster management. The Act also provides specific rules to local bodies in disaster management. Third, further the enactment of 73rd and 74th Amendment to the Constitution, emergence of local self-government, both rural and urban, as important tiers of governance. The role of local authorities becomes very important. The Disaster Management Act 2005 also envisages the specific roles to be played by the local bodies in disaster management. Fourth, legal institutional framework. A legal institutional framework developed based on the provisions of the Act across the country in vertical and horizontal, hierarchical, and the federal setup of the country has been designed for appreciation of response mechanism which has been put in place. Now I have discussed the reactive and the holistic approach to address the disaster management as per the question which has been asked in UPSC General Studies Mains Paper 2020. I will discuss more acts because this is the first act which you have to describe. The other acts will also follow, and that will form the complete answer to that particular question. That is all for now. Before I sign off, do tune in for our next videos. Please share this video with your friends and subscribe in large numbers. We would request you to enroll for UPSC Mains exam papers, GS papers 2021 and prelims come mains exam 2022. We really appreciate your encouragement and constructive suggestions. Thank you.